Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, in part 4 of this series, we are completing our comprehensive look at every single piece of armor in Baldur's Gate 3 with heavy armor. In part 1, we covered cloth and robes, in part 2, light armor, and in part 3, medium armor. So today, we're going to look at all of the heavy armors in the game, which characters they're good for, strengths and weaknesses of the items, and whether they're worth picking up, or if you should just feed them to Gale. By this point, you know the drill, but just to quickly run over the ground rules here, I'm rating these armors based on act, so when you acquire the armor. We're looking at how good it is when you actually pick it up, which means that as we go from left to right in the tiers, the items to the right will tend to be stronger in absolute terms because they show up later on in the game. In S tier, I am placing armors that are best in slot for either very powerful builds or a wide variety of builds. In A tier, armors that are best in slot for narrow builds or interesting alternatives to the S tier armors. In B tier, armors that are pretty useful in some narrow circumstances. In C tier, armors that are unlikely to be useful but have some marginal value, so maybe given the right team composition or exactly the right moment in time, you can use these armors for some benefit. And in D tier, armors that are rarely, if ever, going to be useful. If they are ever useful, it will require a pretty unusual team composition to want to pick up and wear these armors. Heavy armor is available by default to fighters and paladins, and weirdly, you only get heavy armor proficiency if you start with your first level in fighter or paladin. If you multiclass into those classes later on, you only get medium armor proficiency. But you can also pick up heavy armor proficiency as a cleric from certain cleric subclasses, or as a ranger through the Ranger Knight class feature. And if you get it that way, you can still pick it up with levels later on in the build. So there's fewer characters that will be able to use heavy armor. Only certain classes will be able to use it. Some multi-classes will be prevented from using it. But of course it includes some of the most powerful armor sets in the game, so it's very much worth picking up and will be excellent for some builds. Heavy armor also always gives you disadvantage on stealth checks. I won't be mentioning that as we go through, except for the rare exceptions where I will talk about it. Also, just because I know many people will ask this question, I am aware that you can get the Helldusk Armour in Act 1. I'm going to be talking about it as an Act 3 armor, because Larian has tried to patch out the methods for getting it in Act 1 a few times unsuccessfully, so I'm considering it an exploit. We'll talk about it as though it arrives at the point in the game when you're intended to get it in Act 3. Alright, let's get to rating the armors. First up, Ringmail. So again, I'm gonna keep the nitpicking on these armor designs to a minimum here, but the ringmail is such a bizarre design for a piece of armor that I do want to comment on this just a little bit. This is not a historical kind of armor, and unlike the studded leather, it doesn't have even the excuse of looking vaguely like a historical kind of armor. These gigantic open rings that seem to be sewn into this leather backing obviously aren't going to help because they have big holes in the middle. And they're also not closely spaced enough to distribute the force in any way if you get hit by a blunt weapon. So all of the force is just going to go on one of these rings. So it's sort of obvious why nobody ever wore something that looked like this and why you wouldn't. In-game, it gives you 14 armor class, which wouldn't be terrible, except that the 14 armor class is exactly the same armor class as Scale Mail, the medium armor, that most parties are going to be able to acquire on the Nautiloid, or very shortly thereafter, or even just start with. Medium armor allows you to use up to 2 points of your dexterity to increase your armor class. So a character with 14 dexterity and scale mail is going to have 16 AC, whereas that same character wearing ring mail will only have 14 AC. So it's significantly worse than the equivalent medium armor that you actually start the game with, because it just restricts your ability to use your dexterity bonus to armor class. There's just, even if you have low dexterity for some reason, it's not going to be better than the 14 AC scale mail, and most characters obviously are not going to have low dexterity, so there's just no circumstance where you'd ever want to use the ring mail, because you start the game with armor that's just strictly superior than it, so D tier. Chainmail. Okay, so quick nitpick here. D&D uses mail as a synonym for armor, and just calls all sorts of things different kinds of mail. Mail specifically means the kind of closely interlocked rings that D&D calls chain. So the name of this armor is basically chain or mail. If you wanted to refer to it properly, you would call this kind of armor probably a mail hauberk, meaning the kind of mail garment that has a skirt and extends down to or below the knees. If it was just a shirt, like the chain shirt from the light armor section, you would call it a mail shirt, or a mail byrnie, or possibly a jack of mail. Those are all possible options. Points, though, because this was a real historical kind of armor, and a real piece of protective equipment that someone could actually wear, probably shouldn't be classified under heavy armor, because it's actually a quite light and flexible piece of armor, but at least it is a real thing, and a pretty useful thing to have if you're going adventuring. In-game, it gives you 16 armor class, which obviously, because it's a heavy armor, is 16 base armor class, but you can't add your dexterity bonus. So it's on par with the Splintmail from the medium armor, which is 14 AC with a maximum +2 dexterity bonus, for any character with 14 dex or higher. While I don't recommend that you take characters with lower than 14 dexterity, the chainmail is therefore an improvement for characters that have lower than 14 dexterity. So if you're doing a specific kind of run where you have a bunch of characters with less than 14 dexterity, or a character with heavy armor proficiency and less than 14 dexterity, the chainmail is acquirable early enough that it could be an increase to your armor class. Notably also, a lot of the companion characters, the origin characters, have starting odd numbers in dexterity, starting 13 dexterity. So if you're doing like a no respecs run, then you could use the chainmail to give you a slight increase in armor class over the Splintmail for the early game. For that reason, I'm going to put it in C tier, because while it does take a very unusual and unoptimized party comp to want to use the chainmail, there are definitely cases where that could be the right move, if you're doing a low dexterity run for whatever reason. The Splint Armour. So the Splint Armour is 17 AC non-magical armor that you can get from merchants near the end of Act 1. The Splint Armour, being 17 AC but without a dex bonus, is on par with the Githyanki Halfplate or other 15 AC medium armors for characters with 14 or more dexterity. Though again, like the chainmail for a low dexterity run, could conceivably be an upgrade to your armor class by the time you get the Splint Armour near the end of Act 1. However, the same merchants that sell you the Splint Armour will also sell you the Plate Armour, which has 18 AC and is just better in every conceivable way. So since these show up at the same time in the game, and the Splint Armour is just strictly worse than the Plate Armour, it's never going to be worth using, and is going straight into D tier. The Plate Armour. So I've already mentioned that this shows up from the same merchant who will sell you the Splint Armour near the end of Act 1, and is therefore going to be a strictly superior option because it gives you 18 armor class instead of the Splint Armour's 17. That means that it's also better than the 15 AC +2 dex bonus medium armors that are what you've probably been wearing up until this point. And so this is the first heavy armor that represents what is likely to be an improvement in your armor class over the equivalent medium armors available in Act 1. For that reason, a lot of the time, this will actually improve your character's defensive capabilities. While it doesn't have the magical effects of some of the medium armors available, there are definitely routes that you could take through Act 1 that get you to the Plate Armour at a point where it's still worth buying and wearing because it's just an improvement to your armor class. If you do that, though, it won't be long before magical armors that are based on your level, like the +1 Splint that's just better, start showing up, and before you get other 18 AC armors with magical effects that obsolete the Plate Armour. So while there are definitely routes that you can take through the game where the Plate Armour will be a benefit and will be a real upgrade, it will not remain something that you want to stay in for very long. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier, because only some routes through the game are going to pick up the Plate Armour before they have better options, and even those playthroughs are going to find better options very quickly after you pick up the Plate Armour, but still one that's worth keeping an eye out if your playthrough is one that can use it. The +1 Ringmail. So the +1 ringmail gives you 15 armor class. Again, this is going to be less than the equivalent medium armors, so you're taking an AC hit under most circumstances to equip this armor, and gives you a +1 bonus to strength saving throws and strength ability checks. Now, some strength ability checks show up in dialogue, but the vast majority of strength skill checks that you're going to make in the game are going to be athletics checks to push enemies around, which this passive, the body aid passive from the +1 ringmail, doesn't work on. So, irritatingly, the only thing that this armor is designed to do, which is sort of to help you push enemies around, or at least that's the use case that it could have, doesn't work. So the only reason to ever equip this is if you know you're going into a fight where you're going to have to make strength saving throws. There are very, very few strength saving throws in the game, and the ones that are there are still typically you're going to be better off with higher armor class anyways than a very small bonus to strength saving throws. Or, of course, one of the many armors that just gives you a flat bonus to all of your saves, rather than trying to mess around with the +1 ringmail, which is just a downgrade in your defensive capabilities and doesn't improve your athletics checks, which it could theoretically have been a fun use for this armor, but unfortunately doesn't work. For that reason, I'm going to put it in D tier. Maybe you could swap this in before a dialogue or story event where you have to make a strength check, but carrying around that much weight just for that is going to be way more hassle than it's worth. Don't bother with the +1 ringmail. The +1 chainmail. So the +1 chainmail has 17 armor class, one more than the chainmail itself, and gives you 1 resistance to slashing damage, which is mostly not an enormous benefit. Obviously, it's a relevant bonus that you won't say no to, but not one that's going to make or break most combats. It shows up at merchants from levels 4 through level 6, so when your party is between levels 4 and level 6, you can buy the +1 chainmail, and it's going to give you 17 base AC. Now, by the time your party is level 4, you have all of the half-plates that you can eat, so you are probably full up on 17 AC armors, provided that your party has the standard 14 or higher dexterity. However, similar to the chainmail, for parties that have lower than 14 dexterity, the +1 chainmail could be a real armor class upgrade, depending on the route that you take through the game. So you can take, you could theoretically have arrived at the plate armor before this, but if you didn't, then the +1 chainmail might be a bonus for your character who's still got the chainmail equipped. This is a very unusual playthrough, and again, one that requires you to deliberately be not optimizing your characters, because there are very, very few optimized character builds that are going to take less than 14 dexterity, and they're all quite unusual. And so the +1 chainmail is only going to show up in very rare playthroughs, but for a playthrough where you're doing like a no respecs run or something like that, similar to the chainmail, you could benefit from the +1 chainmail. When you hit level 4, it might be a upgrade to the chainmail that your party members might still be wearing. The +2 ringmail. So this gives you 16 AC and shows up when your characters are between levels 5 and levels 8 in merchants. It has the same passive as the +1 ringmail, where it increases your strength, saves, and ability checks by 1, and it also reduces incoming slashing damage by 1. 16 armor class armor by the time you are level 5 is just not where you want to be. You already have had access to the +1 chainmail, if that's even an effect that you want, so there's just no reason to ever pick up the +2 ringmail. I do wish that this passive worked on athletics checks, because then it might be kind of cool for that, but since it doesn't, there's just no reason to ever pick this. The +1 Splint Armour. So this is an 18 AC armor available from merchants between characters level 6 and 8, so pretty late in Act 1 typically. It gives you 18 armor class and 1 resistance to piercing damage. The 1 resistance to piercing damage is the most relevant of these 3 damage resistances. Piercing damage is the second most common damage type after slashing, goes slashing, piercing, bludgeoning, but piercing damage is also the damage type dealt by the most threatening enemies typically, who are archers. You are going to take more piercing hits than you are going to take slashing hits, typically over the course of your runs, because archers are more likely to actually get their attacks off than melee enemies. It's still only 1 damage resistance, of course, but it is at least the best of the 3 damage resistance types. Splint Armour is going to show up relatively late in Act 1. There are routes you can take where you're going to have Plate Armour first. There are routes you can take where you won't have Plate Armour first. So, either way, it's going to be a slight upgrade over Plate Armour or a more significant upgrade over the other kinds of armor that you're using up to this point in order to increase your base armor class to 18. Splint Armour, therefore, is the first one that you are probably going to try to buy, but even then it's not a significant upgrade over the medium armors with +2 dexterity, and doesn't have the magical effects of those medium armors or of the Adamantine splint, which is also likely available around the same time as the +1 splint. Again, this depends a lot on your routing for your playthrough. If you are doing a very specific order of play that prevents you from getting some of the other armors before you hit level 6, or you're doing like all the quests to level up as quickly as possible before you enter combat, then the Splint Armour could absolutely be something that comes into play in your run. I'm going to put it in B tier, same as the Plate Armour. It shows up at around the same time and gives you around the same bonus. These two are relatively interchangeable, so B tier. The Adamantine Splint Armour. So this is available from a story event near the end of Act 1, and gives you 18 AC, reduces all incoming damage by 2, and prevents critical hits from landing on you entirely. So, as well, when an enemy actually does hit you, they receive 3 turns of reeling, which reduces their attack rolls. They get a -1 penalty to attack rolls for every turn of reeling remaining, and this will stack. So if they hit you multiple times, they'll get even more stacks of reeling. Reeling, even though it's harder to stack up than radiating orbs, which it's the same effect as, obviously that's an incredibly powerful effect. So enemies are very, very rarely going to land multiple hits on you when you're wearing this armor. And if they do, you've taken less damage, you aren't taking a critical hit, so you aren't gonna sort of randomly get spiked with damage and die when you weren't expecting to. And it will completely shut down that enemy for the rest of the encounter because they will have so many turns of reeling that they won't be able to hit anything. 3 turns for a -3 attack penalty is really bad for most enemies, and if they do hit you twice, they're getting 6 turns of reeling for a -6 attack penalty, which is just a ridiculous amount of penalty and is going to prevent them from hitting their attacks again for the rest of combat. Combine that with early access to 2 flat damage reduction, which is really powerful, especially this early in the game when a lot of attacks still do very low amounts of damage. It also combines extremely well with other sources of damage reduction. If you can get heavy armor proficiency on an Abjuration Wizard, it combines super well with Arcane Ward. It combines well with the Force Conduit items, blanking on the name, but the glaive that lets you apply Force Conduit. It combines extremely well with sources of resistance, like Blade Ward, in order to reduce incoming damage to you vastly. So the Adamantine Splint makes you incredibly safe when you are wearing it. Removing critical hits from the equation also removes one of the ways that you lose the game when you're playing Honor Mode. One of the things that can happen to a party, and if you are planning well and building well, this is one of the most dangerous things that can possibly happen to a party, is just getting critically hit a few times in a row. That can snowball out of control, because then your other party members are having to spend actions saving the lives of your downed party members and so on. Removing critical hits from the equation just makes your whole party so much safer. Combine that with the fact that enemies that do actually hit you are shut down for the rest of combat, and the just very solid armor class on this armor. 18 AC is totally reasonable for this point in the game, and will stay pretty good throughout the next long section of gameplay, and the Adamantine Splint is going to stay a very relevant piece of armor throughout a big chunk of the game. Really powerful armor set, and definitely worth picking up. S-tier armor, and one of the reasons to go heavy armor is access to this armor set. Alright, so let's start our Act 2 armors, starting with the +2 chainmail. So the +2 chainmail is available from merchants starting at party level 7, which means it's either very near the end of Act 1 or near the beginning of Act 2, depending on exactly how much content and how much grinding you did in Act 1. Since it's most likely to see heavy use in Act 2, I'm counting it as an Act 2 armor, as with all the other things that are available level 7 and later. It gives you 18 armor class and 2 resistance to slashing damage, so it's an upgrade over the Plate Armour, a kind of a side grade from the +1 Splint Armour, but you could theoretically swap to the +2 chain when you are going into a fight with a lot of slashing damage and not much piercing damage, but of course by the time you're using the +2 chain, you almost certainly have access to the Adamantine Splint. So that means that it's only worth taking for a fight with a lot of slashing damage if you either you didn't pick up the Adamantine Splint, maybe you valued some of the other Adamantine items more, or the Adamantine Splint is already equipped by another party member, then in theory you could use the +2 chainmail. I don't even know if that's worth putting it into C tier for, because that's such an extraordinarily narrow use case. But honestly, I just like that all of the chainmails are going in C tier, so I'm going to put it in C tier just for the symmetry. But this is just not one that you're going to want to go out of your way to use in any way. If you haven't picked up the Plate Armour or Splint Armour, then the +2 chainmail, of course, can be worth it. Or if you are specifically worried about slashing damage and don't have the Adamantine Splint, then the +2 chainmail could be worth it for 1 level. But those are very, very unusual circumstances. The +1 Plate Armour. So this is a 19 AC armor, so it's the first breakpoint where wearing heavy armor is actually a meaningful improvement over wearing the easily available medium armors and just having 14 dexterity. 19 AC is going to be higher than you're going to reach with most of the medium armors with a character that's not dexterity based itself. The +1 Plate Armour gives you 19 armor class and 1 piercing damage resistance and is available from merchants starting at level 8, so it will immediately obsolete the +2 chain. 1 level later, you get the +1 plate, which is just more armor class. And again, there are some routes you can take through the game where the +1 Plate Armour is going to show up before you get access to other 19 AC armors. While it is less powerful in general than the Adamantine Splint, you will be better off defensively by having the Adamantine Splint. If you, for whatever reason, want a character who just has the highest possible armor class, maybe you're doing a character with like a Battlemaster fighter with goading attack or something along those lines, then the +1 Plate Armour is probably going to be your highest available AC setup at the point in the game where you get it. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier. Again, I think this is a fairly narrow option for most parties, and not one that you are going to be interested in a lot of the time, but it will, enough of the time that you see it, be an upgrade to your heavy armor character's armor class that I think it's worthy of B tier. The Armour of Devotion. So the Armour of Devotion is an 18 AC armor available from a merchant in Act 2. Weirdly, even though it's plate armor, or at least the visual depicts plate armor, it doesn't have the superior material or superior plate passive. So it doesn't prevent incoming piercing damage. It just gives you 18 base armor class, so it's exactly the same as the normal plate armor, except for its activated ability. Its activated ability, Eternal Devotion, lets you, once per long rest, restore a spent Channel Oath charge, so only works if you're a paladin who is spending Channel Oath charges. Channel Oath charges normally restore on a short rest, so this gives you basically an extra short rest worth of Channel Oath charges for a paladin. Channel Oath charges vary pretty highly in terms of how valuable they are, depending on what paladin subclass you are. For Oath of Vengeance paladins, they're very, very powerful. For other paladins, much less so. So how critical this restoration effect will be will depend quite significantly on what kind of paladin you're playing. And obviously, because this armor is pretty weak as actual armor, the use case for this ability is to swap it in, activate the ability after you've spent a Channel Oath charge, and then swap it back out again for the armor that you actually wanted to be wearing. That's sort of, I guess not really an exploit, but just an irritating and sort of gamey way to play the game, so it's not something that I personally do, but if you're optimizing your Paladin playthroughs, then definitely the Armour of Devotion is going to power them up, making you take fewer short rests and giving you more access to Vow of Enmity and so on, so the Armour of Devotion can be pretty powerful if you're a Paladin who's regularly spending your Channel Oath charges. For that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier, because it's only good for Paladins, but for Paladins, it's just free value. You don't give up anything to just be carrying this armor around and restoring your Channel Oath charges. Like the other items that you can swap in and out, this one I don't think is really worth the effort, but it is free, and free is always good, so A tier is where we're going to put it. The Dwarven Splintmail. Okay, so first, before we discuss the item, I just want to quickly note that for some reason they've decided that for some items, mail is a suffix. So splintmail is all one word, whereas for some it's a separate word. Chainmail is written out as two separate words. I don't know why they did that, and it's vaguely irritating to me. Aside from that, though, this is one of my favorite armors in the entire game. This gives you 19 base armor class, and +2 constitution, as well as the 1 resistance to piercing damage that many other plate armors have, and the +1 bonus to strength saves and strength ability checks that the ringmails have. The +1 bonus to strength saves and ability checks, again, just like the ringmails, is not a particularly relevant ability, but being a 19 AC armor, at this point in the game means it's the highest armor class that you have access to, almost certainly, and +2 constitution is just so awesome for a heavy armor user. This is great for any character that wants to tank, so any fighter or paladin who is designed to be up in the front lines. Just increasing your hit points is great, and having that on an armor is awesome, and it's great for, especially for spellcasters. So any spellcaster that can get heavy armor proficiency through a 1-level cleric dip or a 1 or 2 level fighter dip, or any character that is multi-classing with paladin can use this to more easily maintain concentration on spells, fix their relatively low hit points, because you get +1 hit point per level from the extra constitution when you have this armor equipped, and just generally solve all of the problems that come with being a spellcaster. If you have like a 1-level dip in cleric, this gives your spellcaster +12 hit points by the end of the game, +1 to all their constitution saves, so they're maintaining concentration on their spells much more easily, and is just all around an incredibly solid armor, as well as giving you just a very high armor class, meaning you're much less likely to be hit. There are many armors that you will wear for specific builds that are better for those specific builds, but the Dwarven Splintmail is one of the most widely applicable armors in the game. There are very few characters that cannot benefit from wearing this, just because it provides such a solid package of abilities, and +2 constitution is so great, that the Dwarven Splintmail is definitely going into S tier. Another notable thing about this armor is that you can buy it from the merchant, but the merchant then, after you've bought it, also still often drops a copy. It doesn't happen 100% of the time, but in several of my playthroughs I've gotten 2 copies of this armor, one from buying it from the merchant and then one from subsequently killing the merchant afterwards. So you can often end up with 2 copies of this armor, which is great because so many different characters can make excellent use of it. The Flawed Helldusk Armour. So this is available through a story event near the beginning of Act 2, gives you 18 armor class, 1 resistance to piercing damage, and whenever you are hit by an enemy within 7 feet of you, so basically a melee attack, but enemies who are making ranged attacks from very, very close to you, just outside of your melee range, can still be affected by this. They might take 1d4 fire damage. That might is based on a DC 13 dexterity saving throw, so the enemies have to make a DC 13 dex save after hitting you, or they take 1d4 fire damage. Now, this does trigger off of more things than you would expect it to, so it can trigger off of some environmental damage things, it can trigger off of, like, some damage auras that some kinds of enemies have, but for the most part, this is, like, once a turn, a DC 13 dexterity save for 1d4 fire damage, which is such a tiny, tiny ability as to be completely irrelevant. So this is basically just 18 AC armor with 1 piercing damage resistance, which is just going to be worse in general than the +1 plate that you're going to get very, very soon after this. Worse in general, because it requires, worse in general than the +2 chain, because it gives you less damage resistance. It's slightly better. I mean, it's strictly better than the +1 Splint Armour, which you probably acquire around the same time. But you just have so many better options than the Flawed Helldusk Armour by the point in the game that you get it, that it's going to be useful only very rarely. Since it is 18 AC armor with piercing damage resistance, and in theory you could do something with the Infernal Retribution passive where you're doing some kind of getting hit build and then you do 1d4 damage back. I'm going to put it generously in C tier, but you can pretty safely ignore the Flawed Helldusk Armour in most playthroughs. The Protective Plate. So this is kind of a weird one. The Protective Plate has some just sort of oddnesses around it that make me think that it was intended to be a different armor and maybe made it into the game in an incomplete state or with some sort of bugs attached to it. The Protective Plate gives you 18 armor class, and it shares both a model and an icon with Plate Armour, as well as being unspawnable using third-party tools. So if you are using a mod, as I do often to test items, to spawn items in, you can't spawn the Protective Plate because the item ID for it doesn't work. It also doesn't, unlike every other heavy armor, give you disadvantage on stealth checks, which makes me wonder if that was just some kind of database entry error that they made when making this item. The Protective Plate, in addition to that, gives you resistance to necrotic damage. So it's an 18 armor class armor that gives you resistance to necrotic damage and doesn't give you disadvantage on stealth checks. That's available relatively early in Act 2. For that reason, it is going to be useful for some encounters where you are likely to take a lot of necrotic damage. So if you're going into a fight where you know there's going to be necrotic damage, then you could swap in the Protective Plate. And you could maybe do something weird with the fact that it doesn't give you disadvantage on stealth checks, alongside being a heavy armor user. Maybe for a ranger with the Ranger Knight feature, you could be doing stealth checks while still wearing heavy armor with the Protective Plate. Most characters that are going to be making stealth checks will be dexterity characters, and so we'll get more AC out of one of the uncapped medium armors, like around the same time as you get the Protective Plate. You could just have the Yuan-Ti Scalemail get more AC and better passives and everything, but the Protective Plate's resistance to necrotic damage could be relevant in some fights, and the fact that it doesn't give disadvantage on stealth checks is kind of cool for a heavy armor, so I'm going to put it in C tier because of the potential to use it for certain fights for the necrotic damage resistance. The Reaper's Embrace. So this is available under both circumstances near the very end of Act 2, and so is in some ways an Act 2 armor and in some ways an Act 3 armor, because while you do get it during Act 2, it's going to see most of its play during early Act 3. I'm calling it an Act 2 armor, though, because you do by definition acquire it during Act 2. It gives you 19 armor class and 2 flat damage reduction, so at the point in the game where you get it, it's tied with the Dwarven Splintmail and the +1 Plate Armour for the highest available armor class, and 2 flat damage reduction is obviously excellent for the same reasons it's excellent on the Adamantine Splint, just reduces all incoming damage by 2. It also gives you a toggleable passive and an activated ability. The toggleable passive makes you immune to forced movement when it's on, but gives you disadvantage on dexterity saving throws, so enemies can't shove you around, but you will get hit a little bit easier by entangling effects or fireballs or whatever. And the active lets you attempt to numb every character within 10 feet. Numb gives you advantage on attack rolls against those enemies and reduces their movement speed by half, but it's a DC 14 wisdom save, so you can pretty safely ignore that active. The passive is also, except for some very specific fights, something that you can pretty much ignore. So mostly the Reaper's Embrace is just a 19 AC armor that gives you 2 flat damage reduction. But that's a very good thing to be at this stage of the game. It's going to be a little bit before we get armors that just strictly outclass it. So it's mostly competing with the Dwarven Splintmail, which it has the damage reduction instead of the increased hit points, and the Adamantine Splint, which it has higher armor class than. And maybe you have critical hit immunity from another source or something. So the Reaper's Embrace is definitely going to be best in slot for some heavy armor characters, depending on your party setup, throughout the beginning of Act 3. If you care about the damage reduction more than the Constitution bonus, maybe you're not casting spells, or you have a lot of damage resistances that make the damage reduction particularly valuable, and if you either didn't get the Adamantine Splint or just have critical hit immunity from other sources, then the Reaper's Embrace is just going to be your best bet for armor, so it's going to go into S tier. It won't stay in S tier for very long, because in Act 3 we're going to get stuff that outpaces it relatively early, but there will definitely be a chunk of Act 3 where this is your best armor on several varieties of character. And finally for Act 2, the Rippling Forcemail. So the Rippling Forcemail gives you 17 armor class, and whenever you take slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning damage, you gain 2 turns of Force Conduit. Force Conduit reduces all incoming slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning damage by 1 per turn remaining. And if you take damage while you have 5 or more stacks of it, you deal force damage in a 20-foot radius. So you can explode with force damage. That force damage can then trigger Cull the Weak and stuff. This is a core component of builds that just passively kill enemies by walking near them, is using Force Conduit to deal passive damage, and kill enemies with Cull the Weak by stacking Force Conduit up and other sources of damage reduction like Arcane Ward. You can end up with ridiculous amounts of damage reduction. The Force Conduit itself is limited to only 7 stacks, but it stacks whenever you take slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning damage, including self-damage, so you can do this to yourself using some items that allow you to damage yourself, or just have like a mage hand poke you in order to stack this up. And so you can pretty easily reach very high damage reduction levels with the Rippling Forcemail. Now, to really use this item, or abuse this item, you have to be doing a pretty specific and rather exploitative build in order to just stack up a bunch of Force Conduit and abuse it. So I'm gonna consider it mostly for its use just if it's armor that you're actually just wearing, rather than for the kind of game-breaking exploit builds that are based around this item. The Rippling Forcemail, if you just put it on for 17 AC and a bunch of damage reduction when you take physical damage, is still pretty darn good. You can combine this with like Blade Ward or anything like that. Anytime you get hit, you take less damage. It's going to, in most fights, average out to less damage than the just flat 2 damage reduction from the Adamantine Splint. But if you have other ways to stack damage reduction, or if you're using a build that does damage to itself, like the Marshal Exertion Gloves and stuff like that, then you can make use of the Rippling Forcemail. I'm going to put it in A tier because you do have to build around it, but it is one of those items where if you build to abuse it, then it's off the charts powerful, but as just a piece of armor that you actually put on for 17 armor class and a little bit of damage reduction, it's outclassed by other passive armors. So the Rippling Forcemail, a little bit difficult to rate because of how abusive its main usage is, but overall I think A tier is good, because if you build around it, it's incredible, but if you don't, then it's merely acceptable. The +2 Splint Armour. So the +2 Splint is 19 AC armor, available from merchants when your party is level 9 or higher, and it is identical to the Dwarven Splintmail, except it's called Splint Armour, written as 2 words, whereas the Dwarven Splintmail is called Splintmail, written as a single word, and it doesn't give you +2 Constitution. So that means that since you are very, very likely to have access to the Dwarven Splintmail, the 19 AC, 1 piercing damage resistance, and +1 to strength checks and strength saves and checks on the +2 Splint Armour is very likely to just be strictly obsoleted by the Dwarven Splintmail by the time you get access to the +2 Splint Armour. In addition to that, there's also the other alternatives. The Adamantine Splint is still probably better for a defensive armor. The Reaper's Embrace is definitely better for a defensive armor when you get access to that. So there just aren't that many circumstances where the +2 Splint Armour is ever going to come up. By the time you get access to this armor, it's just it's extremely unlikely that you don't just have better options. So it's going into D tier. The +2 Plate Armour. So +2 Plate Armour is available from merchants starting at level 11. So you need to be pretty far on into Act 3 before you get this, most likely. Though again, if you've gotten all of the XP available earlier in the game, you might hit level 11 relatively early in Act 3 and get access to the +2 Plate Armour quite a bit earlier. +2 Plate Armour gives you 20 armor class, and also you take 2 less damage from all physical damage, so you get 2 damage resistance to all slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning damage. So it's quite a significant upgrade over the other passives from the just normal magical armors, because +2 damage resistance to all physical damage, obviously less powerful than 2 damage resistance to all damage, like the Reaper's Embrace or the Adamantine Splint, but still very good. And 20 AC is possibly the highest armor class armor that you have at this point. That being said, by the time you get this armor at level 11 and can buy it from a merchant, it's very likely that you have access to better armors, or have settled into a strategy where you don't particularly need to increase your armor class by 1. By the time you are in the late game here, these like 19 AC armors plus a shield plus some armor gear will have your armor class high enough that you're going to be outstripping your other party members by quite a margin regardless in heavy armor. So running up the score by increasing your armor class even a little bit further doesn't actually matter, because enemies are mostly going to be targeting your allies rather than this character, since AI in Baldur's Gate decides who to attack based on how easy they are to hit. So going from 19 to 20 AC is a real bonus, of course, but not as impactful as you might think, because it will just shift enemies' attention from your tanky heavy armor character to one of your squishier characters, potentially. That being said, 20 armor class is still very high, and that's good, and the damage resistance is still relevant. So if you get this, if you've leveled up really fast, and haven't reached some of the other armors available in the game at this point, if you're like level 11 while still in the lower city or something, then you can benefit quite a bit from the +2 plate, or while still in the outskirts of the city, you can benefit from the +2 plate just showing up in some of the merchant shops there and increasing your armor class. So I'm going to put it in B tier because it's not a bad armor and it might increase your AC in some circumstances, but you will have better options by the time you get it in most playthroughs. The Armour of Persistence. So this one's locked behind some story events, but some relatively common story events for many playthroughs, and is available from an Act 3 merchant. The Armour of Persistence gives you 20 armor class, so tied with the +2 plate armor and better than anything else we've talked about so far. 2 flat damage resistance, so just similar to the Adamantine Splint or the Reaper's Embrace, just reduces all incoming damage by 2, and gives you resistance and Blade Ward as the spells permanently. Blade Ward gives you resistance, so you take half damage from all bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage all of the time, and the resistance cantrip increases all of your saving throws by 1d4. So that means that you are taking almost no physical damage ever, because you have 20 base armor class and Blade Ward, as well as the 2 flat damage reduction, which, remember how I mentioned that the damage reduction is combines extremely well with sources of damage resistance, not resistance the spell, which is a little confusing because this armor gives you both. Well, this armor gives you all of those things in a single package. You get flat damage reduction, and you get multiplicative damage reduction, and you get higher armor class, meaning that enemies will hit you very rarely, and if they do hit you, it will do almost no damage. In addition to that, heavy armor users are often mostly at risk from failing checks on spells. Because you will have such high armor class and damage reduction and so on, you will often be very hard to kill with physical damage. And with the Armour of Persistence, you're basically impossible to kill with physical damage. That means that what actually puts you at risk is spells that might disable you and take you out of the fight. Things like Hold Person and similar. This armor gives you permanent resistance, increasing your saving throws by a d4, meaning that you're much, much less likely to be dropped by effects like that when you're wearing the Armour of Persistence. All of these effects work together extremely well. They're all extremely powerful. The base stats of this armor are incredible, and so altogether this is just the best piece of defensive equipment in the entire game, barring, abusive damage reduction stacking, like with the Rippling Force Mail and so on. But the Armour of Persistence, when you're playing the game normally, is just the best piece of armor in the game, best defensive piece of armor available, and is going to keep your party alive, your character alive, no matter what is thrown at it. S-tier armor easily, and again, this is one of the reasons to get heavy armor proficiency, is access to this truly excellent piece of equipment. The Blackguard's Plate, which, yes, is how you pronounce it. You can blame the British for that one. That's what I do. The Blackguard's Plate gives you 19 base armor class and reduces all incoming damage by 1, so less damage reduction than the other heavy armors that provide damage reduction, but gives you advantage on wisdom saving throws. Advantage on wisdom saves is super powerful, especially for a heavy armor user, because, like I just talked about with the Armour of Persistence, the only thing that's putting you in a lot of danger as a heavy armor user who's likely very hard to kill with physical damage is being taken out of the fight by a saving throw targeting effect that disables your character. Most of those in the game target wisdom, so advantage on wisdom saving throws can make you much, much harder to disable when you have the Blackguard's Plate. Now, a lot of parties are going to be able to get this through Hero's Feast, which you will probably have access to around this time. If you have a cleric or druid in your party, you can use Hero's Feast. If you're using a camp caster, which a lot of honor mode parties do, not one that I personally do for most runs, but definitely a viable strategy, then you'll always have access to Hero's Feast. So you can gain advantage on wisdom saves pretty easily through other sources. If you are playing a run where you don't have access to Hero's Feast, then the Blackguard's Plate can definitely be useful for advantage on wisdom saves to sub in for encounters where you know enemies have spells that target wisdom, like if an enemy has Hold Person or Hold Monster, then you can use the Blackguard's Plate to make your melee characters much more resilient to that effect and prevent them from being taken out of the fight. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier because it does have a real use case, though most parties are going to be able to supersede that with access to Hero's Feast. But if you aren't doing that, then the Blackguard's Plate can definitely be swapped in for some fights where you know you're going to be targeted by effects that it's good against. The Cerebral Citadel Armour. The Cerebral Citadel Armour gives you 18 armor class, immunity to fear, so you can't be frightened or afflicted with other sources of fear effects. Not all fear effects inflict frightened specifically, and this gives you immunity to most of them. And it also gives you the Illithid Protection passive, which, if the wearer is infested by a Mind Flayer tadpole, they get +1 to intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saves. Most companions are infested by a Mind Flayer tadpole, so this works on most companions, and oddly enough, it works on all of the origin companions, or all of the companions except for Halsin and Jaheira, which makes sense, because they don't have tadpoles, but also does work on hirelings who can't gain illithid powers, so the whatever tadpole infestation or absolute infestation the hirelings have, I guess, counts for the Cerebral Citadel Armor, or they just wrote in the armor as an exception for Halsin and Jaheira rather than tagging each character as to whether they were infested or not. All of that goes to say that this is an armor that gives you 18 armor class, fear immunity, and +1 to your mental saving throws on most characters. And you get it relatively late in the game, by which point you just have better options for those effects. Fear immunity is good, but you can get that from a lot of other effects, and the +1 to wisdom saving throws is the one that mostly matters. Intelligence and charisma are rarely targeted by enemy saves. Intelligence more than charisma, but both quite rarely. you will do better with the Blackguard's Plate, for example, which just gives you advantage on wisdom saving throws, which also makes you much better at resisting fear, so it doesn't give you complete immunity, but makes you better at resisting it. This is another one that is just superseded by the existence of Hero's Feast, and unlike the Blackguard's Plate, actually costs you quite a bit in terms of armor class and defensive capabilities in order to put this on. So while this armor is a cool piece of environmental storytelling when you find it, it's not particularly useful in the game. I'm going to put it in C tier because it is a boost to your intelligence save, which is otherwise somewhat difficult to boost in Baldur's Gate 3. So if you're going against enemies that force you to make int saves, you could use the Cerebral Citadel armor, but obviously things like the Armour of Persistence are just going to be better. And fear immunity is not totally irrelevant. Again, if you don't have access to Hero's Feast or other sources of fear immunity, this can be useful, but most parties are not going to find a use for this armor. The Emblazoned Plate of the Marshal. So this is locked behind some story choices. You have to make specific story choices in order to get this armor. And it gives you 19 armor class. All incoming damage is reduced by 2, so again, it's similar to the Reaper's Embrace in that sense. It gives you 19 AC, 2 damage reduction. It gives you fire resistance, which is a very relevant damage type to be resistant to. Obviously, there's a lot of fire damage in Baldur's Gate, so resistance to fire damage is quite relevant. And a +2 bonus to your saving throws. +2 flat bonus to your saving throws is awesome. It's not quite as good as the Armour of Persistence, which gives you just resistance, which is on average +2.5 to all your saving throws. But +2 to your saving throws and fire resistance combined with damage reduction by 2 for incoming damage is a really good defensive package. It also gives you Fire Shield, which you can cast once per long rest, and the warm version of Fire Shield gives you cold resistance, so you can gain cold resistance in addition to fire resistance from this armor if you need it, and of course do a little bit of retaliation damage. All of those things together make it a pretty solid piece of armor, though by the time you get it, you have access to a lot of more powerful armors, most likely, most notably the Armour of Persistence. You will be able to reach around the same time that you can reach the Emblazoned Plate of the Marshal. There might be some playthroughs where you're able to get the Emblazoned Plate before you get the Armour of Persistence, but for a lot of them, you won't get it until later on. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier. It's still a solid piece of armor that gives you a lot of powerful abilities, and if you're going into a fight with fire or cold damage, you could swap this in order to gain those resistances, because those are very useful damage resistances to have in the game. Just a very solid piece of armor that you won't be sad to have equipped. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite have just the raw stats to crack the top rank of armors, but it's still just a very good piece of equipment overall. And finally, the last of the Act 3 armors, and thus the last piece of armor in Baldur's Gate. We will now have talked about all of them, the Helldusk Armour. Now, for those of you who skipped the intro, I do want to say again that I'm aware that the Helldusk Armour can be acquired in Act 1. Since Larian have tried to patch out that method, I'm going to be considering that an exploit, so we're going to be rating this armor as though it's acquirable only at the intended time in Act 3, but there is a way to get it in Act 1, which obviously breaks the game balance wide open. To do this, what you do, I'll just briefly describe it. What you do is when you first see Raphael to engage him in conversation, keep one character stealthed and far away, enter the conversation, have that character attack him from stealth, and then he will disappear. He then later reappears at your camp, cast silence on him, and then kill him so he can't disappear from your camp, and then he'll drop the Helldusk Armour. This is a pretty convoluted method. Maybe there's other methods, but I know that one still works, so those are the steps to do it. And that will get you the Helldusk Armour in Act 1, which obviously is a way more powerful item than you're intended to have in Act 1 and totally breaks game balance wide open. So obviously, in Act 1, it's going to be an S-tier piece of equipment, and will obsolete a lot of the other pieces of equipment on the armor list because of how the Helldusk Armour works. All that said, though, we're going to consider its usage when it drops relatively late in the game, near the middle or end of Act 3, depending on the order that you do things in, where The Helldusk Armour gives you 21 armor class, so the highest base armor class of any armor in the game, but does not allow you to add your dexterity modifier. But just like the Elven Chain from medium armors, you are considered proficient with the Helldusk Armour when you're wearing it. Similar to the Elven Chain, the way they coded the Helldusk Armour was just by making it a piece of cloth. It doesn't actually count as heavy armor for most things. So effects that only work when you are unarmored still work with the Helldusk Armour. This means you can use the Bracers of Defense with it, have 23 armor class. You can use Monk's Unarmored Movement to still move quickly when you're wearing the Helldusk Armour, because of how they coded it. It doesn't work with sources of unarmored defense. It won't stack with that. It won't stack with mage armor, that kind of thing. But it does work with the Bracers of Defense and Monk's fast movement, which is a pretty powerful thing for this armor to be able to do. Also, whenever you succeed a saving throw, the caster gets set on fire for 3 turns. So when you succeed a saving throw from an effect or a spell, the person who cast it gets set on fire for 3 turns. You get resistance to fire damage and immunity to burning, and 3 flat damage reduction, and the ability to cast Fly as the spell, as a bonus action once per long rest. Fly is normally an action, so being able to cast it as a bonus action is awesome. So altogether, this armor gives you 21 AC, 3 damage resistance, resistance to fire, and sets things on fire when you succeed on saves against their effects, and lets you fly once per long rest, and can be worn by anybody. Obviously, this package of abilities altogether is still insane, even in Act 3. The sheer armor class that it gives you is going to outstrip most other effects. Only medium armor characters with the uncapped medium armors can get higher armor class than a Helldusk Armour character. So this is going to be the highest AC setup in the game for any character, any class, with some very narrow exceptions. It gives you 3 flat damage reduction, which means that for damage reduction builds it's going to be incredible, and a variety of powerful effects like the flight. Now, for a purely defensive setup in Act 3, the Armour of Persistence is better at keeping you alive, because physical damage resistance is better than fire damage resistance. So for a heavy armor character specifically, the Armour of Persistence is going to be better if your goal is just to stay alive. But the Helldusk Armour can be worn by anybody, so you can have this on a wizard or a sorcerer. They can still cast. It's especially fun for sorcerers because you have the Pyro Quickness hat that sets you on fire, and gives you additional actions. And this can be used to gain immunity to that fire. So for a fire sorcerer, the Helldusk Armour is particularly powerful. But obviously for any character who can get access to the Helldusk Armour, every party is going to be able to use this because anybody can wear it, and any character is going to be very happy using it. Fly as a bonus action is also a pretty powerful effect. I mean, by the time you get this, you might have the Illithid flight, but for parties that aren't using that, Fly as a bonus action is just a super powerful option that gives you a ton of additional mobility, and the sheer defensive power of this armor is awesome. It also can turn off enemy concentration effects, because they could, if you succeed on a save against the concentration effect, they'll catch fire, take damage immediately, and then potentially fail concentration. So if they're concentrating on something that hits both you and an ally, you can break their concentration with the fire. The Helldusk Armour has a bunch of these little synergies, but the main thing is just it's a 21 AC armor that gives you 3 damage reduction that anybody can wear, and so obviously it's going straight into S tier. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at all of the heavy armors in Baldur's Gate. If you've watched this whole armor series from the beginning, thank you so much for sticking with it. Obviously, this is a lot of information about armor, but I hope it was enjoyable. What I've learned about heavy armors is that, honestly, the ones that I thought were good are the good ones. These 5 are the ones that you're going to end up wearing in the vast majority of your playthroughs, and they're a very solid set of armor that you're pretty happy to wear. Most heavy armor characters are going to be wearing medium armor through most of Act 1, so it's not surprising that only one Act 1 armor shows up in S or A tier here, and it's one that you get late in Act 1. And my opinion on that hasn't changed. That's still going to be the play, is to stay in medium armor for the early game and then swap to heavy armor in Act 2. But the heavy armors that you get access to give you a variety of powerful abilities and let you emphasize different things. And of course, the Helldusk Armour is just broken no matter when you get it at any point in the game. As always, if you think that there is something that I missed, or a use for one of these armors that I missed, or I'm misrating something, definitely do let me know in the comments. I'm very open to moving things around in these tiers, and just like with many of my previous tier lists, I'm going to do a follow-up video for any corrections for this video or previous tiers that I need to make, or if you are convincing enough and can get me to move some armors around in various tiers, I'm definitely open to doing that, and we'll do a video to follow up and do any moves that I think are necessary. Of course, if you have enjoyed the video, then feel free to leave a comment. It helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I do appreciate people taking the time to leave a comment and like the video. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 tier lists and other strategy game content. And if you've really enjoyed the content, then of course I would appreciate it very much if you'd consider leaving a super thanks or becoming a channel member. Obviously no obligation, but of course I appreciate it very much when people are generous enough to do that. Alright, my friends, hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you next time.